Now, Durban-based NGO Asiye eTafuleni is calling for greater social security for the city's informal traders. A study conducted by the NGO has found that 80% of informal traders it surveyed continue to go hungry despite the easing of lockdown restrictions. Most of them make a living at Durban's Warwick Junction, one of the biggest transport hubs, in fact, in South Africa. Here's a look at the market during pre-COVID times. Now, co-founder of Asiye eTafuleni, Richard Dobson, says most traders rely on social grants to survive, and the market is dying a slow death. He joins us now, in fact, via our video link in Johannesburg. Richard, once again, a warm welcome to you on the show here on the AM Report. And the sad irony of the story is that it's the people who sell food that are going hungry.
Morning, Michelle. Yes, I mean, that is the irony. And of course, the other irony is that social support networks, particularly childcare grants, are really meant to supplement someone's income. They're not meant to, in fact, be the total dependency. And so that's really what is now become really evident in this research that we've been able to co-partner with colleagues from around the world. And of course, the figure you gave is only just one of the alarming statistics when we actually see that 90% of the children in those households are experiencing hunger, then it is really quite startling. And so as you note, and I think sometimes it's a misconception simply because people are selling food that they have access to food. It's a bit like the corner grocer always taking stock out of his shop and going home and feeding his family off the groceries, but ultimately he's got to restock his table. So yes, it is, and it does happen if someone's table's overstocked, if it looks like their vegetables may be approaching the sell-by dates, they might well take them home. But the biggest challenge now is because the economic cycle has been completely destroyed because of COVID. People don't have the money to restock their tables, so whatever stock people might be seeing on tables when they drive through these areas of the informal markets, that is the minimal that they can actually put on the table, and they're totally reliant on selling that stock so that they can make a meager income to take home.
Yeah. In terms of what Asiye eTafuleni is doing, given the outcomes of this survey that was undertaken, how does the NGO fit into what hopefully will be solutions to what's unfolding in Durban?
Okay, I think it's multifaceted. I mean, I think, first of all, one of the main outreaches that we are engaged in is to start to really build a pandemic-resistant environment, because really the pandemic is going to be with us for years to come. So how do you actually convert the trading activities, the lifestyles, to an assumed and adopted lifestyle, knowing that that's the way you've got to trade? So, for instance, even just exchanging money is dangerous because it can actually carry the pathogens. So part of that work is about sanitizing. Big demand around that to the city is that they've really got to establish public toilets and public conveniences. I mean, in all our South African towns and cities, if you had to try and find a public toilet, you'd be absolutely horrified. Well, first you'd be lucky if you found one, and then if you found one, you'd be horrified about its condition. And then it's to start, and this is a huge opportunity, is to start to conscientize us all about the challenges we now face. I'm surprised that our South African memories are so short. I mean, during the major lockdown, we displayed huge levels of humanity by people really identifying where the needs were, rallying in all sorts of ways to actually try and reach out to colleagues who actually were really in dire straits. But suddenly we've forgotten that. So now we're starting to see, for instance, across the country, really punitive enforcement against informal workers, insistence that permits are always paid up, otherwise you are removed from the street, can't access a market. So we need to, the third point would be this kind of rediscover our sympathy and our humanity. And then lastly, it is structural interventions, both in terms of any support network that we can put in, but of course the big challenge about these is that they need to be sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, and the other issue is government intervention, because informal traders play such an incredibly important role in terms of the provision of goods and services, but they have very, very little protection, if any.
Correct. And so if you look at food security, which was the topic where we started, I mean, it obviously sits within a system. It is the end result, which is the catastrophe we're facing now of home hunger. But of course, it is about the system. Food security is about bringing food to market at affordable prices, and that's why Warwick is so absolutely critical, because food is sold at affordable prices to the commuter hub of the city, but it is also how that food is produced. Obviously, we are still reliant on historic methods which are apartheid biased, which is commercial farming, the cold chain. The cold chain is all about climate change challenge. Climate change challenge is about the waste generated from that system. So markets, the point I want to make, markets, the like that we see in Warwick, operated by very passionate people, and we really need to see them as business people. And they're the ones that are really sustaining the food security network in our country at this stage. And if you look internationally, this is definitely the way that cities are going. Barcelona is one of the notable ones. The other point, of course, is just the quantum of informal workers. So Durban has roughly 24% of the kind of income-earning population are working informally. And if you look at it globally, that number is 1.5 billion to 2 billion people. So, and South Africa, we know it contributes something like just over 5% to the GDP. That's just in retail. So it really is something we've got to start dignifying, and we've got to start accepting it as really being something which has a very real place in our society.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking about issues around dignity, you know, the treatment that so many informal workers will tell you they receive from sectors like the police force, you know, in terms of how they are treated on the streets of various parts of the country. But another issue that your survey has also brought up, Richard, is the issue of child services. People essentially don't have anyone to look after their children as they try to go and earn a living. Your survey finding that this has increased now the number of children on the streets of Durban.
So that was always a challenge. And of course, now what has happened is because people have less disposable income, there's some harsh decisions to be made. And one of them is that you can now no longer afford whatever care arrangements you had for your child if you're a working informal person. And so now the only option you have is to bring that child to the street. Now, none of us, would never espouse this as being the way that you should manage your care for your child. But what is, and within the industry, the expression is, what are the counterfactuals? The counterfactuals would be if you didn't bring your child to work with you, that child would be left at home, maybe with a slightly older sibling, but really in suboptimal care in terms of what the parent or carer would like to do. So that's one of our major programs, is to try and see, and we believe we've got a solution, and the solution that we are promoting at the moment is what we call a pop-up creche or pop-up care facility. It's a gazebo-based facility, but the point is that it is actually at the workplace. So woven in amongst the trading spaces, we believe one can actually provide viable care for children.
In terms of Warwick Junction, I'm just looking at the results of the survey that you conducted, Richard, and one of the workers you spoke to there, working at Warwick Junction as someone selling bread, making around 2,500 rand per week, now
Yes.
having to rely on 2,500 rand per month from childcare grants from 3 children. Warwick Junction
Correct.
itself, such a huge contributor in terms of the space it allowed for informal traders. Going back to pre-pandemic levels, do you see that happening? Do you see it being revitalized anytime soon?
So the person you referred to is a bead seller. And of course, so one part of the answer to your question is that we need to have the wider system functioning. So, I mean, their main market is selling to wholesalers who are retailers to the market, but they're servicing and supplying beads to tourists. So if tourists don't come to the city, that's a challenge. And then another big one, of course, is the bead service traditional functions, weddings. And so if there's COVID restrictions which are preventing the gathering in those functions, there obviously is no need for that. So first point is the external system has got to be functioning again. But I mean, many people are using the language, you've got to build back better, whatever the cliche might be. But definitely, sadly, on the back of real hardship, yeah. I think there's new opportunities for us to rethink systems differently. And so once I think public transport starts to run more fully, and we are able, particularly when vaccines start to become effective, public transport will be safer, and then we'll start getting that system running. That is really the engine that is driving a lot of the trade and the presence of Warwick. So part of the answer is much more about external systems than it is about the willingness, the energy of people that are there.
Yeah.
The last point is that many of the products that are sold there are culturally appropriate and desirable products. So often people think about informal trade, but particularly the Warwick context, as being retail that's in competition with formal retail or any other mode of retail. But they are products that are just not sold by anyone else anywhere in the city. So it's traditional medicine, it's all sorts of things which are not sold by any other shops. So it's not in competition, it's a complement, and it's actually completing the matrix of what we should be offering as a culturally responsive city. And of course, coming out of that is a real economic advantage.
Richard, before I let you go, you know, Asiye eTafuleni is doing its bit in terms of coming up with solutions to some of the challenges facing informal workers. In terms of government's response, you know, you've done the research. What happens now in terms of finding solutions, given that almost a quarter of the working population in Durban comes from the informal sector?
I would think it just simply boils down to recognition. Now, that might just sound a simple word, but if you truly recognize the sector as being important, not just people who are blatantly occupying public space, ignoring all sorts of management dictates, etc., but you truly embrace what this means. And it isn't just a survivalist activity. I already said that it is about making our cities culturally appropriate. It is about transforming our post-apartheid cities to be cities which are really functional, and we all as South Africans can enjoy that multicultural expression and what is on offer. So recognition, I think, is key, but if you really truly adopt that, then the rest cascades from there. Then your legislation is appropriate. Then you are sympathetic in terms of your enforcement. Then you are creative in terms of your developmental strategies which start to respond into the sector. And most importantly, and I'll end on this note, and that is that it needs to include the voice of the people who are so-called affected. Most of the time it's just top-down, and there isn't this inclusion of the voice of the people who are directly affected and what they would prefer and what they really need to help them.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard Dobson, thank you very much for your time this morning. This distressing story coming from Asiye eTafuleni's co-founder, the Durban-based NGO calling for greater social security of the city's informal traders. Around 80% of those traders surveyed continuing to go hungry.